everyone. Nice to see you all. Really excited to kick off this conversation with Cary and Sanders around net zero, and really importantly, credibility behind making a claim like that or working towards it. So today we'll be having this conversation and it'll kind of be Cary and Sanders, and then at the end, we'll open it up to the audience for questions. The idea is that you can leave questions in the comment section right on LinkedIn, and then we'll pull them across the screen at the end for them to address and hopefully keep the conversation going that way. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Sanders and Cary to introduce themselves and get started.
Oh man, this is a spicy topic. I'm looking forward to it. Should be fun. But really glad that Cary could join us today. So maybe, Cary, you want to do a quick introduction to yourself, and then I can do my introduction and maybe walk us through a little bit about what Carbonhound has been thinking about in terms of how we look at this challenge around how people can make credible claims.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks so much for hosting us, or hosting me in this case, Sanders and Lauren. It's a real pleasure to be, part of the call here today. And I agree, this is a spicy topic. I think what I hope is that maybe we can make this topic a little bit less spicy and offer some stability to, kind of this whole process for companies. But so my name's Cary. I am an environmental markets attorney by trade. I've worked with nonprofits, businesses, and governments around the world to navigate both the voluntary carbon market as well as climate finance generally. Started off in the clean energy sector, and you'll hear about what we do at Greenomix here today in a moment. And so at Greenomix, what my role is as CEO is to help de-risk the process of using carbon credits as one component of a high integrity climate change mitigation pathway, such as net zero. So I think we're going to probably dive into that in a moment, but Sanders, happy to kick it back over to you for next steps here.
Yeah, for sure. So obviously I'm Sanders Lazier. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Carbonhound. So we automate high integrity climate reporting and management for over 100 customers across Canada, the US, and some people in Europe and in Australia. And really what we wanted to talk about today was, okay, maybe what is net zero? What does that mean? What are the critical paths to get there? What are some of the risks and challenges that have been coming up recently? And really just have a spirited discussion around the role that offsets can play within that ecosystem of claims. So where I would start out is maybe just talking a little bit about, so first of all, what is net zero? So net zero is when you're effectively looking at the amount of emissions that you have as a company, and I think of it kind of like a bank balance, right? So every time you're emitting, some CO2e as a company, then you're adding to that bank balance. And offsets are one of those ways, or carbon credits are a way to effectively reduce that bank balance over time. And so net zero is when that bank account balance is zero. So that's the simplest way. There's obviously a huge amount of nuance to this, and there's lots of different types of claims. There's lots of standards that will dictate, how much do you need to reduce versus how much can you offset in order to get to that net zero number. So there's a lot of nuance within all of that. But maybe I thought what I would do is start off by maybe talking a little bit about my own personal journey around offsets, just because I think it was probably quite representative of what many of our clients are going through. So, and then I think that will lead us quite nicely, Cary, into the problem that you're trying to solve.
Great. Yeah. And on the bank account reaching zero, in this case, that would be a good thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
One of those few balances in business that you want to be negative.
Exactly. Yeah.
Perfect. So really, when I was thinking about offsets, it's a journey that I went on because I was thinking about how do we provide the ability for customers to do their part to address climate change, right? And so we can't just be looking at reducing emissions over time because, frankly, there's a lot of hard to abate emissions, hard to reduce emissions, right? So when looking at emissions coming from, let's say, flights. So if we're looking at sustainable fuels and net zero flights, that's a fair distance away, in the order of magnitude of 5, 10 plus years away in terms of being able to do that. And not only that, we don't really control how much fuel is being burned on that flight. Surely we can take economy seats rather than first class seats to decrease the amount of area that we're taking up in that flight, and therefore be a bit more efficient with our carbon usage. But fundamentally, you're not going to be able to reduce that to zero unless you're, unless you've got a lot of great fully green high-speed trains around you that you can travel, or maybe you can walk and bike to most of your destinations. But assuming all of that isn't true, I was really sitting down and I was trying to figure out, okay, well, what do we do in that circumstance? Because on one hand, we really want to encourage companies to reduce their emissions. Then on the other hand, you've got these remaining hard to abate emissions that are really challenging to address. And moreover, when we're thinking about investing in decarbonization, my belief is there's a few different pieces here, but one of them is that we're often not taking into effect all of the non-operational factors that might be good reasons for you to take on a particular project, right? So we might just think, oh, okay, we're going to install solar panels. It's going to be 8 years payback, and then it's going to be cash flow positive. So that's great from an operational perspective, but you're not necessarily thinking about the external impacts, whether it's the impact in terms of the marketing value of the claims that you might be able to make with lower carbon products and services, or maybe the new contracts that might unlock with companies that are increasingly looking at green procurement. So there's a lot of business reasons as to why you'd want to think about making a net zero claim, because fundamentally we've seen case studies over and over again where companies who are leading with sustainable products and services are winning deals with large customers, typically, government contracts. We're looking at Fortune 5,000 companies. All of them are looking at how sustainable products can fit into their ecosystem because they're looking to reduce their risk and reduce the impact of their products and services. So there's a lot of incentives out there, I guess is what I'm trying to say, to try to make these claims. And there's clear studies out there that show the value around these claims as it relates to employee retention, as it relates to increased margins, increased growth, you name it. There's a huge business case for it. So as a result, there's a lot of pressures to make these claims. And so I think increasingly there's been a lot of challenges for consumers of these labels and these claims to understand what's real and what's not. And so when looking into the details of this, what we did is we said, okay, what is a carbon offset? Because sometimes they're $20, or actually sometimes they're $5, and sometimes they're $500. So why is there such a variance in price? And what does it mean, right? There's a million different projects to choose from. There's different standards to choose from. What does it all mean, right? And so, if we're to kind of move on from the idea of, okay, there's obviously lots of value as to why we might look at net zero and more. And so I think where I'd like to focus this conversation is, okay, how do I do this with credibility? Because I think, especially when we look at the environmental claims aspect, let's just put it this way. Companies have, they're living in a high expectation, low trust environment where consumers and their partners have high expectations for what businesses are going to do from an environmental perspective, but they have extremely low trust that they're actually doing those things, right? And so therefore, going about net zero with any sort of lack of credible approach really raises red flags for all of the consumers that you're trying to build for. And fundamentally, without that trust, there's negative brand value that gets created. And you might as well not do it at all. So when we were thinking about how we're going to integrate this into Carbonhound's journey, there's a real discussion as to whether or not we included offsets at all as something that we would even support our clients on in terms of helping facilitate that. And I think where we ended up was that, look, we need to be really careful because there's lots of examples of reversals in offsets. For example, you look at the California buffer pool for natural forestry credits removals, and that's gone down the last 2 quarters, right? So there's lots of, you look at the news, you see wild forest fires. There's risks everywhere that when you buy these offsets, they might not actually be real. They might burn, and then all of a sudden, all that carbon's back in the atmosphere, right? So I think what we've been really trying to navigate through as a business is, okay, how do we look at this huge, in many cases, largely unregulated market, and navigate it for our clients to help them make decisions that align to their mission, but also provide a huge amount of credibility. And so that's really where we've gone to. And so just full disclosure, like we don't really, like, we'll help facilitate offset purchases and sales, but it's not something that's our core business. But when I was chatting with Cary and what he was working on, I was like, this is interesting, because I think it might solve some of the issues that we've been struggling with around the integrity of these claims and the integrity of these offsets. So, Cary, a little bit of a long preamble there, but love to pass it over to you to talk to you a little bit more about what Greenomix is working on and how they're looking to address that confidence gap.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the context there, Sanders. And I think the conversations and the experiences that you've described in terms of businesses that are really putting their best effort out there to figure out how can we create a credible, trusted pathway for our company to do the work that matters on climate change and celebrate that work without exposing themselves to a lot of the challenges that come along with offsetting is a frustration that I've seen both in counseling companies about this, but also in simply keeping up with the news and seeing that companies have made some substantial investments in this space and doesn't always pan out in the way that you would hope that it does. So I think with that, maybe I want to just take a quick step back and talk about what net zero is for a moment, and then the role that both direct emissions reductions that Carbonhound can support, as well as the offsetting component, which is what Greenomix does, kind of fits into that kind of overall picture of net zero. So let's see here. I promise I will only share slides for a moment here, but I think visualizations can be helpful sometimes. So net zero is a scientific term, right? And it's a scientific term that has been approved by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that, as Sanders said, means globally to address climate change, we need to balance emissions with greenhouse gas removals by mid-century. That's what we have to do in order to avoid 1.5 or even 2 degrees Celsius of global temperature increase. And when you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, right? So the graph that you're looking at here is what it would look like if you emit 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide and don't offset it. You'll see the white graph representing kind of the slowly degrading amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but a large portion of it will still be there 500 years from now. And so, of course, without offsets, the net atmospheric greenhouse gas levels are the same amount that you would put into the atmosphere. And so the outcome of this, of course, is that the amount of emissions is continuous. It'll stay there for a long time, and it is contributing to global warming as long as it's in the atmosphere. So what carbon credits or carbon offsets are designed to do is to mitigate the amount of greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere. And so in this graph, what you're seeing here is you're taking the same amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere that you saw before, but then you are offsetting it through the reduction or removal of greenhouse gases on a long-term basis. And if all goes according to plan, what you'll see is that the amount of greenhouse gases offset exceeds the amount of greenhouse gases emitted, which can contribute to a company's fair share of their global net zero goals. I'm talking about things fairly broad here for illustrative purposes, but as Sanders mentioned before, our general recommendation is to pursue independent certifications such as SBTI, for example, to showcase that your company is both contributing to the direct emissions reductions that they need to achieve, but then also stepping in and using carbon credits to mitigate any residual emissions, whether that's in the form of what's referred to as beyond value chain mitigation or direct offsetting with kind of carbon accounting to showcase that you've contributed to global net zero in a meaningful way. Now, taking a moment to think about some of the challenges here. When carbon credits don't work as promised, the problem with that is that the amount of emissions in the atmosphere can exceed the amount of emissions that were successfully offset. And the result of that being that if there was a net zero claim in place, that's no longer technically accurate, right? And so what you're seeing here is a hypothetical scenario where a carbon credit, or if this was 100,000 tons, 100,000 carbon credits work perfectly fine for a number of years, but then a failure event occurs, and the net atmospheric greenhouse gases is once again positive after a few years. And so if you have a scenario such as what Sanders described, where there is a physical reversal, such as a natural disaster, or something else happens that can lead to this, the impact on the climate is essentially that you're no longer contributing your fair share to drive towards global net zero, and that's kind of where that problem comes in. And once again, this is just one example. There are, of course, existing safeguards in the market, such as buffer pools and monitoring tools that can play an important role in this challenge. But I think we've also seen that those tools aren't sufficient by themselves to protect against all potential risks that companies can face when buying carbon credits.
And Cary, sorry,
yeah.
can you talk a little bit about what is a buffer pool exactly?
Yeah, thanks, Sanders. So I'll take the screen off here for a second. So a buffer pool is essentially a set-aside group of carbon credits that are managed by carbon standards, like Verra or Gold Standard, for example, are the two big players in the carbon standard world. And so when carbon credits suffer kind of failure events, right? In theory, you could go to this buffer pool of kind of extra carbon credits and then swap out any carbon credits that had problems with units from that buffer pool to keep your kind of overall program on track. And buffer pools do have, substantial reserves in place, and they have been used to compensate for these types of issues in the past. However, there's a few things about buffer pools that have, I think, left a lot of corporate buyers of carbon credits thinking that buffer pools by themselves aren't sufficient. One of which is that carbon standards have the autonomy to decide when and how buffer pool credits are used. And if a company or stakeholder does not agree that a carbon credit needs to be replenished from the buffer pool, then you can have a mismatch between a solution that could be used and whether it actually is being used. But then the other thing is that buffer pools are static, right? They are based on historic carbon credits that were issued based on the standards of the time. And so they don't have the ability to adjust to new kind of market rules or expectations on quality or even compliance requirements that might be applicable for some companies. And again, this is all very general. I'm sure there are exceptions to each of those circumstances. And there are a lot of great people working on solving for these challenges. But generally speaking, I think what we've seen is that the market has not seen buffer pools as a sufficient solution for this risk of reversal or kind of other failures that may occur.
So, Cary, if you will, I just want to quickly set the scene, because I think we've talked about a few different groups of people, right? So you've got your corporate buyer, which is often what we're talking about. So they're trying to optimize for high integrity credits to make their green claims, right? Then you've got the voluntary standards or the government standards in some case. So they're the ones that are kind of the ledger, right? So they're setting the rules of what gets to they're setting the rules in terms of the standards that they accept onto their ledger. And then they also have a ledger to make sure that the same offset isn't being used twice by different people, so double counting, right? So they play an important role in terms of making sure that those buffer pools are available. They set the policies around how big those buffer pools need to be for different types of projects. So you kind of think of it as, okay, you've got your referee, if you will, you've got your company, and then you've got the project developer. So they're the ones that are actually doing the work to bring that project to market, like those offsets to market. So they're working with the people on the ground. They're actually doing some of the measurements. They're trying to adhere to the rules that these carbon standards have put in place. Yeah. So you can start to see that there's some natural tension between everybody, all those different parties, because the project developers are trying to maximize the amount of carbon credits that they're creating. The standards are trying to maintain the integrity of the solution, but at this and they're also trying to make sure that there's no double accounting, and they're trying to act as the setter of the rules, if you will. And then you've got the corporate who's trying to figure out how to pay the least for the best outcomes, right?
That's right.
So I just wanted to kind of, because I think we're kind of talking about all these different pieces here. So when we talk about like Verra and Gold Standard, those are great examples of those kind of the referees, like the rule setters, the ones who are holding that ledger and setting those rules. And so often as a corporate, you're buying from those carbon standards because you're trusting that all of the processes they have in place to maintain quality are being put in place.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that, just to put a point on something that I think you said, which is really important, is that there is some tension. I've seen, during my time as an environmental markets attorney, that the parties are aware of where there are risks at play in the gap between the way that carbon credits are expected to perform and the way that they might perform, and then what it is that you're supposed to do about that. And so, tools like buffer pools are one way to kind of mitigate that risk, but it doesn't fully address the suite of challenges that can impact carbon credit performance from an end user perspective. Take for example updated kind of climate policy guidelines, right? One of the big debates in the voluntary carbon market in the last few years has been the role of carbon credits that are issued on the basis of greenhouse gas emissions reductions, being you were going to emit 100 tons and you only emitted 50 tons, versus greenhouse gas removals, which means that you pull carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it typically underground in the form of either biomass or geological sequestration, such as direct air capture. And what we know from a climate science perspective is that both of these kinds of emissions mitigation tools are quite literally necessary to meet our long-term climate goals, right? The IPCC says that you have to conserve forests, build clean energy, do all that stuff, but then also remove carbon at massive scales by mid-century. And so carbon credits can help to finance all of that, but different parties have different opinions about kind of the role that carbon credits can play, whether they're good enough to be able to be used for certain types of purposes, and then kind of what do you do if there's a mismatch between what parties are hoping to achieve and then what actually happens. And to that end, I'll just, we're going to jump in there, Sanders.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think this is the perfect intro to what you guys are working on.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, our philosophy on all this at Greenomix is that, carbon credits are, they are commodities, right? They're intended to simply, offset or mitigate 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions measured in carbon dioxide equivalents. But they often kind of perform a bit more like stocks or securities, where you make your best judgment about how they're going to perform and whether they're going to deliver the results that you promise. But then things can change after you buy and retire a carbon credit that can impact both the real and the perceived quality of those units. So what we want to do is bring carbon offsetting from a place that looks kind of like day trading or picking stocks, where you do your best based on the information at hand. But mistakes can, cause problems, and you need to be able to address those problems in such a way that is sufficient to meet whatever your climate goals are, such as a net zero certification. And we want to take it from kind of that process to a place that looks more like working with a retirement planner or a financial advisor, where you build out diversified portfolios of credits that are based on reasonable quality criteria. But then you layer in financial assurance. Our product is carbon assurance, in order to step in and address any challenges that may occur in the future. And our position is that while carbon credits do phenomenal work, of course, to finance clean energy and conservation around the world, I think we will still continue to see problems, and we need to just accept that and figure out what is the best pathway forward to dealing with those problems head on, as opposed to trying to ignore them, or simply, kind of always be saying, well, next time we'll get it right. Because we're at a point where we really need to get it right now. So this is a slide we had up earlier that basically showcases what happens if carbon credits fail and then the emissions that are in the atmosphere exceed the amount that was offset, even if it's just for a period of time, right? This impacts our global climate balance. So what we do at Greenomix is, in the event of a carbon credit failure, if that carbon credit is backed by carbon assurance, we would deploy resources to essentially replace any lost climate mitigation benefits on a rolling basis through the procurement of new units that meet the applicable quality criteria that align with whatever a client's requirements are for their own climate certifications or kind of internal policy requirements. And so what you're seeing in this graph here, in contrast to the last graph, is that even if a failure event occurs, if you can step in and replace those carbon credits with new units that meet the applicable quality criteria, organize that data and documentation to prove that it's been done properly, you can keep this net atmospheric greenhouse gases line below zero, which means that the total amount offset exceeds the total amount emitted over the time period under consideration. And the graph here is for about 10 years, but the same would apply in either a shorter or longer term period of time. So essentially, we want to make a carbon credit risk or carbon credit failure event about as much of a challenge for your carbon credit portfolio as a single stock losing value in your retirement account would be for your retirement planning, which is that nobody wants it to happen, but it goes from being, potentially a catastrophe to something that is simply an expected outcome that we can adjust for and make sure that the overall, balance of emissions remains intact. Yeah.
Basically, it's insurance for offsets.
Yes, we avoid the term insurance because insurance is for at least in the United States. You'll have to tell me how it works in Canada, Sanders. Insurance is it's a contract that has predefined coverage events that are essentially the only things that can be corrected for as those challenges occur. And a lot of the risks that impact carbon credits, or at least the biggest risks, are often risks that you can't always foresee ahead of time. So we think of it more like a retirement plan for carbon credits, where we use conservative assumptions regarding future costs and returns to plan for a smooth retirement of your carbon credits, if you will. Yeah.
I'm just imagining all the carbon credits in the assisted living homes.
Well, we're working on building a very comfortable home for them at Greenomix for their prolonged retirement. Yeah.
Yeah. Happy with their bingo and their open bar. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And, I think I want to state too that I think, one of the reasons why I was really excited to do this work with Carbonhound is that carbon credits are not a one-stop solution for net zero. I think that in the early days of the voluntary carbon market, when there were kind of these pilot programs by companies that wanted to showcase the benefits of these investments that they were making in carbon credit projects, there have been some over promises, I think is probably the best way to put it, regarding the role that carbon credits can play. And the truth is that carbon credits are absolutely not the only thing that a company has to do in order to achieve their net zero goals or their climate goals. They have an obligation to reduce and track their emissions as well. But carbon credits can be a very powerful tool to accelerate your progress in a cost-effective way, and in doing so, channel capital into projects around the world that do just incredible things, from swapping out cook stoves in the homes of developing economies where women are often cooking with firewood or kind of coal equivalents that have substantial air quality impacts on themselves as well as their children, with technologies that are much lower emissions and don't have those health impacts. And I could go on. It's really undisputed.
Yeah. The time that they spend going and finding that firewood and how that could be put towards better use as well, right? So there's a lot of like second and third order impacts, which some of which are easier to discern than others when evaluating these sorts of projects. Yeah, I think I would mention around offsets is that they can really, really great forcing function in terms of how do you set a price on carbon within your organization? Because I think there's a lot of studies out there that will show that, if we put a price on it, then all of a sudden, all those business cases that we're talking about in terms of taking additional action on decarbonization start to look a little bit different. And I think the other aspect of it is that if you're thinking of it as a way to put a price on carbon rather than a way to kind of absolve you of all of your climate-related sins, I think it also creates a lot more kind of positive momentum in terms of expectations around what you're going to get from those offsets too. Because I think at the end of the day, like in aggregate, you're creating positive environmental movement, right? So you're supporting projects that are going to move the needle forward. I think even when you look at it from an accounting perspective, emission factors get updated, things change. And so the science gets better constantly. So, this idea of being at net zero is a little bit of a moving target sometimes, right? So you can see, for example, looking at like the Oxford net zero standard, right, where they're basically saying, okay, you can only use, so there's two different types of offsets. So you've got your avoided emissions, which is kind of what Cary was talking about, the stovetop with the solar stoves, right? So they're using coal. There's a baseline for how much emissions come from coal use for stoves. You swap those out with solar. The difference is what those offsets would be, and that's what they would be selling as offsets in the marketplace. Then you've got removal type, which is where, like, trees, great example, they're absorbing atmospheric CO2 and converting that into wood and as a storage device. And then that is also technically, a carbon sink, right? So what Oxford has basically said is, look, you can only use removals. We only want to see removals, because their issue is that there's so many issues with setting those baseline numbers. It's almost like a counterfactual accounting exercise, right? Where we would see examples of like REDD and stuff in different areas where they were picking specific zones nearby that were the most deforested so that they could maximize the amount of credits that they would get from those projects. So I think, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of like nuance in terms of the projects and types of projects that kind of comes out of this. And so I think any way we can provide more assurance on those removals is obviously, what we would want to do. And it's probably, I'd love to get your view on this, but my view would be that it's probably a little bit easier to provide that sort of assurance on removals rather than, avoided emissions because of that accounting factor.
Yeah. So I think that we see those things quite similarly. Let me highlight a few of the areas where I think you're absolutely right, and then I'll share a bit of our perspective on the role of conservation and other kind of emissions avoidance tools. So first of all, it's absolutely true that there have been examples where carbon projects were designed in such a way that they were later kind of understood to be not quite right from a greenhouse gas accounting perspective, right? And so that's why carbon standards update their methodologies. That's why there are initiatives like the ICBCM, which has set out what they call core carbon principles to kind of set these baseline quality expectations for what anybody should expect out of their carbon credits. And so, all those tools are designed to kind of, push towards quality on a rolling basis. The role of carbon removals versus avoided or reduced emissions, there's a little bit of a nuance on avoided versus reduced, but I'll just use avoided for the purpose of this conversation. A lot of the, I think, policy around preferring removals has come from the fact that it's easier to calculate both the additionality as well as the baselines associated with carbon removals, which are kind of two of the key quality criteria that go into carbon credits. Because it's always easy to show that if you hadn't paid money to plant trees or to build a direct air capture facility, those things wouldn't have occurred, right? Whereas with conservation, to your point exactly, if you're trying to prove that a forest would have been cut down, if not for the carbon finance that has protected it through something like REDD+, you almost have to kind of, peer into the multiverse, right? See what would have happened if we hadn't done this in order to know for sure how that would have worked out. But despite that, organizations like the Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, Environmental Defense Fund, and Indigenous peoples groups around the world have all said it's very important that we continue to invest in forest conservation through carbon financing, because we know that's a requirement for meeting our global climate goals, And it's also an economic lifeline for a lot of the indigenous and local communities to do good work in their communities to address climate change. Um, However, those risks remain, right? And so at Greenomix, our approach to that on the insurance side is that when we work with clients to build out their carbon kind of offset strategy and then weave in carbon assurance for that, our recommended model is that if you're going to use avoided or reduced emissions like conservation or clean energy, you need to backstop that with carbon assurance to fund the long-term permanent removal once the project that those carbon credits were sourced from has essentially kind of ended its crediting period or its access to capital. And so in that way, you can contribute to short-term emissions reductions that we know have to occur while backstopping them with long-term durable carbon removals, which we know you have to achieve for kind of the mid-century net zero goals that the IPCC has set out. Sorry for a lot of acronyms there. I hope that wasn't too much.
No, but I think we've been kind of chatting around it a little bit, but
Mhm.
so we talked about a couple of different criteria of what makes a good carbon credit, right? So one
Mhm.
is additionality, right? So as you just explained, if I give you $1, would you really need this dollar in order to make this action happen,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Which creates a lot of issues, especially on the reduction side, when you start looking at, like, for example, I think we have, you might have some public organizations that look at this as a way to pay for things that really, they should be paying for and
Mhm.
probably could pay for. And so trying to figure out additionality sometimes on reduction efforts can be tricky.
Mhm.
Um, but that being said, okay, so you've got additionality, you've got negativity, right? So, let's use direct air capture as an example. So basically, if we're setting up a bunch of fans that are sucking in a bunch of air and then, pumping, using various materials to pull the CO2 out of that air and then put it into a barrel and then pump that into, let's say, a mine so that it can turn
Mhm.
limestone or something like that. We just got to make sure that that all the energy we're using for that process is actually, either green energy and like there's a certain, like, you're actually seeing an actual reduction,
Right.
given all those processes that need to occur in order for that carbon to be sequestered, right? So
Right.
that's
Mhm.
negativity. And then another big one, in my opinion, is permanence. So
Mhm.
you've kind of talked about it in your presentation. You showed the slide of what happens when something is impermanent, but maybe let's talk a little bit about what does permanence mean? How do I know what I'm buying when I'm buying
Mhm.
these things? Because I think there's a lot of assumptions there. For example, many projects will assume 100-year lifespans, which is what's considered permanent. But the
Mhm.
projects themselves, if you look at the underlying contracts, they're not actually 100 years,
Right.
not protected for 100 years. So, especially when you look at forestry, that's generations of time, right?
Mhm.
So, how do you look at permanence? And I think also, how do we think about permanence in the context of price, right?
Mhm.
So, when we're looking at $5 versus $500
Yeah.
offsets, like, how do you think about that in terms of value for money as it relates to the permanence of those solutions?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sanders, and there's a lot of elements to it. So I think maybe just to bring up the slide that you were referring to for a moment here is a reference point on the risks associated with impermanence. So carbon projects can do phenomenal work right away, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that work is going to last forever, right? So let's say that you conserve or plant a forest in an area, and that area thrives for years, but then there are wildfires or natural disasters of another sort, and what you see is that there is a reversal where the carbon stock is released and the net atmospheric greenhouse gases is once again positive going forward. To Sanders's point, I think that there is a real challenge in the market around the expectation that carbon credits will automatically be permanent versus what a lot of them are able to actually achieve. And so, if you're making claims like net zero, that are based on the expectation that your carbon credits are permanent, but the projects that they're sourced from only have funding for 15 to 40 years, well, it may well be the case that they succeed for a long time and contribute to, very important climate change mitigation work, but that does not mean that those benefits are going to be around forever. And when they fail, your company can find themselves, on the hook for the implications of having made claims regarding, expected permanence if that permanence doesn't actually pan out. So, the approach that we have at Greenomix is essentially that we're trying to achieve the most cost-efficient, high-quality method of ensuring that when carbon credits are used, we do value their benefits, even if those benefits are temporary, but we do so by linking carbon credits in such a manner that if any individual carbon project or carbon credit source from the project is not itself permanent, we can step in and make sure that your overall carbon credit portfolio does have the level of permanence required to offset based on kind of the leading scientific expectations with respect to how we know greenhouse gases like carbon stay in the atmosphere. I will also say an interesting wrinkle to this is that, and this is more just kind of, I think, a topic of interest of mine versus something that I would recommend somebody incorporate into their climate strategy today. But if you do, so we talked earlier about the role of kind of carbon removals and the proving of additionality in baselines. Carbon removals oftentimes are, unless they're geological, can have a higher permanence risk by virtue of requiring ongoing project maintenance. Think about tree planting, for example, right? If you can successfully avoid emissions and prevent them from going into the atmosphere in the first place, assuming that your baseline is correct, that your additionality is correct, et cetera, avoided emissions can actually be inherently permanent, right? Once you avoid energy being sourced from a more carbon-intensive, energy source, for example, if that has maintained, if that's correct, then those benefits are permanent simply because the carbon never went into the atmosphere in the first place. It's also a very good reason as to why it is that direct supply chain decarbonization, like what you all do at Carbonhound, is so important, because the best way to address climate change is to avoid those emissions going into the atmosphere in the first place. But my 2 cents on it is we're not going to achieve global zero emissions overnight. So we need high quality ways to mitigate those emissions in the most effective way that we can.
Agreed. I think so just kind of separate but related note is I think a lot of companies also get caught up in this idea of, oh, we're going to do this GHG, we're going to do this project to reduce or increase our operational efficiency, which will reduce our GHG emissions. Hey, maybe we can sell those for carbon credits and make some money off of this as well. And I think that comes up a lot. And I think that there's an element here of, okay, certainly you could do that, right? But this is just kind of a warning, is that if you sell off those credits, if you want to spend $100,000 to build the project out, so first you have to have a certain amount of scale for that to even make sense, right? Secondly, now you have to figure out where you're selling them to. You have to get consultants involved to actually do all of that work for you to be able to get it so that they meet the criteria, the quality criteria that these carbon offset standards have. Then you have to worry about actually selling them. So what if you don't sell them, right? And you also don't necessarily know what price you're going to get for them too, because the pricing, the market dictates the prices in many cases in terms of what gets sold. So, and you've also just sold off the environmental benefits that to a third party, which means that you then can't leverage that same environmental benefit when selling your core product and service to your core customers. So, the one thing I always recommend to businesses is don't get caught up in this trap of trying to figure out how to game the system by doing offset projects yourself. Leave that to the professionals who have large, who can do large scale projects and have high amounts of, credibility in that space in terms of developing those different projects, and their outcomes of those projects are directly linked to their take home, right? Leave it to them. Focus on doing reductions for your business, because then you can say, hey, I'm 30% more efficient than my competitor over here. So if I'm selling to Apple and they're trying to make a net zero claim on their watch, they're going to have to buy 30% fewer offsets to make that claim if you work with me, which means that we might be charging the exact same price to Apple, but ours is actually cheaper, right?
Right.
And so it
Right.
allows you to focus on your core competency as a business and just sell a better product to your existing customers, leveraging all of your knowledge, all of your expertise, all of your sales channels, and sell more of your core product and incorporate it into your core offering, rather than trying to create this, frankly, like distraction of a project to create offsets. So I just wanted to kind of just say that, out front, because I think we do get a lot of questions from corporates being like, hey, like, how can we take advantage of this carbon credit thing? And I understand where they're coming from, but I think ultimately they're doing themselves a disservice, because they could really just be winning more deals and growing the revenue of their business more broadly, rather than thinking about the minor impacts that a carbon offset project could be for them.
Yeah, I think that is very, very often the case. I have had a lot of conversations with business owners and kind of engineers who are developing new, more sustainable technologies or practices that have heard there's this great opportunity to get paid for your emissions reductions. It's called carbon credits. But the fact of the matter is that it's a lot more complicated than that, right? There's costs, there's timeline. Not everything that reduces or removes emissions actually is eligible to be certified as a carbon credit. And then even if it is, you got to ask yourself, what's your plan to sell those credits? Who are your customers going to be? Why would they want to buy that from you? And so, working on, though, figuring out ways to monetize and recognize the value of emissions reductions based on kind of, supply chain contributions to upstream companies who have net zero goals. That's something else that both of our companies are working on. But it is at the same time very important to recognize carbon credits are something that can help with that, but the vast majority of the time, there's probably better solutions other than using carbon credits if you're a kind of more sustainable supplier and looking for ways to get the value of your climate contributions recognized by your buyers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed. Okay, we've got about just under 15 minutes left here, Lauren. Cary, is there anything else that you wanted to cover before we jump into questions?
No, I'm not sure if there are any questions from the chat, but I'd be happy to kick it over to that.
Yeah, so I can jump in with a couple of questions just from the panel, if you will. And then, as mentioned, if anybody watching wants to ask questions, feel free to just leave them in comments in LinkedIn. I think the question that I have, and I'm sort of often talking to people who are looking to start this journey, there is no or limited or very little budget available for starting on these journeys, even if they are feeling the pressure to do something. So I would just love to understand how you would respond to people who are working with not a lot, but need to justify the value of assured or high integrity work, whether Sanders on the emissions measurement side, right? Could I just go do this myself using a spreadsheet or an online calculator? And then on the offsets or reduction side, what is the value really? And how do they communicate that to their stakeholders of having that level of integrity?
So maybe I could take the first bit.
Yeah, please.
So I think fundamentally, if we look at budgets that we're typically dealing with in these organizations, they're obviously often new budgets, because this is something new for organizations, right? And so what I would say is that instead of, trying to get a budget and then building a business case afterwards, like, build the business case first and then drive the budget off of the business case, right? Because I think if it's just a nice to have kind of corporate social responsibility thing, then sure, like, maybe invest in biodiversity and think about like partnering with WWF and investing in biodiversity projects and stuff, and get that story that way. But if the company's looking to, if the company's looking to actually look at this as a value driver, then I think it's a very different conversation. So sure, you can go and do your own spreadsheets, but the big challenge that, in fact, I had before starting Carbonhound was that I can do all this work myself, and I'll probably get it wrong in some ways. I might get it mostly right, if I'm quite diligent about it. But regardless, it's got no credibility. And as we talked about earlier, low trust, high expectation environment for businesses that simply doesn't cut it, right?
Mm-hmm.
For anyone who's going to take, if you actually want to generate business value from it, then the people who care about this stuff care about it, and they'll look at the details and get an understanding of what kind of claims you're making and why and how valid they are. So my point of view would be, feel free to do it yourself if you want to do it to engage your employees, if you want to do it to build culture. I think all those are perfectly valid reasons to look at taking some sort of climate action, and it does start internally often with a project like that. But
Mm-hmm.
if I would really think about, okay, how can we make real impact? Well, that's by like incorporating it into your business practices and creating business value from that project. And so maybe they use those initial projects as just a way as to kind of proof of value or to kind of build some momentum. But I would say just you're better off sticking to, doing what you can afford and not trying to make claims than trying to squeeze too much into too small of a budget and creating a lot of risk for your brand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, over-promising and overstating what you've achieved is one of the biggest risks that you can cause by virtue of jumping into the climate process, or the climate transition plan process without doing the kind of strategic planning that it requires. Just this morning, I saw the today's ESG Today email blast had a story about how 2 out of 5 companies have dropped suppliers to date as a result of poor carbon emissions performance. And so, in the context of my budget is only X, I don't know if that's enough to address climate, to meaningfully make a commitment on climate and then kind of implement that. I would really perhaps reframe that and say, can you afford to find yourself in a position where one of your or multiple of your biggest customers said, we've made a climate commitment, whether it works for you or not, we need you to be able to perform at this level and provide this data by the next contract cycle, and you lose that deal, right? There's a substantial risk to inaction, and there is a substantial reward to being seen as a high integrity early mover in the space. Younger people, millennials, Gen Z, we and they are the customers, investors, and employees of the future, and the present, increasingly in the case of millennials. And we care deeply about these issues, which is why you're seeing more and more pressure to to jump in and do this work. So I think what I would just say, Lauren, to your question is that start with greenhouse gas accounting, because you need to know what your requirements are going to be in order to achieve your long-term goals. But I would also say that the cost of inaction is substantial, and it's something that companies should really think about. You can see substantial returns on investments in climate work in terms of customer interest, et cetera. But there's also a substantial risk associated with inaction that's not hypothetical. Businesses are impacted by it every day.
And just to build on that, that's actually one of the reasons why we've got a business insights product in early access where customers can see look at their customer base and look at where those pressures are going to be coming in, what the expectations are, and what reporting standards they're going to have to meet. So yeah, I think that's the number one risk that I feel like is being undersold right now. I think people are being very reactive to that top line revenue risk. And it just ends up being an email in their inbox, and then they start running around trying to figure out how to solve for it, rather than thinking about how they can be proactive and leverage it as a business advantage moving forward. So yeah, totally.
Yeah. Yep. Cool. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. We have time for one more question, and then we'll sort of wrap everything up. But the question is really around, okay, so somebody has understood the value of high integrity measurement, reduction, and offsetting. What resources would you recommend for people who are looking at different service providers, different types of offsets, different types of calculators, if you will, to really ensure that they are getting that level of integrity? You mentioned a couple of standards and databases that are available, but would just love any advice you would give to people who are trying to do this right, and where to start looking and where to find those red flags in the sea of options.
Yeah, it's a great question. Sanders, do you want me to start with that, or would you like to jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So this is climate policy and carbon markets are very complicated. They're complicated because they rely on an evolving body of science, an evolving set of rules and regulations, both in the voluntary and compliance side of this market. And because of that, the process of getting started on offsetting your emissions can appear fairly daunting, given the risks that are associated with, picking the wrong credits or making the wrong claims based on the actions that you've taken. Um, what we do at Greenomix, our mission really is to take this to a place where it's like working with a financial planner or a retirement planner to build a diversified and assured portfolio that you can rely on and leverages a lot of the same risk mitigation tools that you would expect out of your financial portfolio's performance and kind of manage your actions. So, I mean, first of all, what I would say is that's what we're here for. Always happy to jump on the phone and talk to anybody who is looking for, how to get started on the offsetting component, of their overall climate transition plan. But I would also say that you should look at some of the guidance. If you do want to get into the details and learn more about it, you should look at the guidance from organizations like the ICVCM, who has a set of core carbon principles that outline, what they believe, what that organization believes is the kind of minimum requirements for carbon credit quality. So it's the floor as opposed to a ceiling. As well as you can quite soon look to the United Nations Paris Agreement crediting mechanism for farther guidance on, a new kind of carbon credit program that's going to be managed under the Paris Agreement. And one of the interesting things about that development is that there are a lot of requirements around protecting against reversals and failures and kind of incorrect calculations that are in that new guidance that was approved at the Conference of Parties a couple of weeks ago. And that was a pretty big story. I'd recommend taking a look at it if you haven't seen it. And so, just understanding what the market believes is quality, why they believe that, and then making sure that you check those assumptions with a lot of the environmental advocacy organizations that have dedicated many years to helping to build this market in a high integrity way would be my recommendation on how to learn more about this sector.
I think Carbon Plan in particular, I find really good.
Yeah.
So they do a great job of explaining it. They're a little bit of a watchdog group as well, which is fun. So they are involved in some pretty high profile articles where there were takedowns of different projects. So I like Carbon Plan a lot. I think to your point, Cary, I think looking at the UK and specifically, I like the Oxford kind of standard.
Yeah,
as
the
well.
principles.
So they got some good principles there too. Those are kind of the two sources I look at, and then obviously, kind of it's interesting to read through. Vera, who's the largest carbon registry in the world. Gold Standard is probably the other one. Those are probably the two. Gold Standard is probably a little bit better on the S side of things, on the social side, compared to VCS. But those are the two organizations that are kind of the big gorillas in the voluntary space as well. That they've got lots of content on their website too. So, but it's good to get to look at it from all the different stakeholder perspectives, right? So the nonprofits are good as kind of looking in from the outside in, and then obviously also looking at and understanding the logic behind these different registries is really important too.
Yeah.
On the quantification side, I'd say greenhouse gas protocol is kind of the number one standard for how we measure things. So that would be the Bible that I would suggest. Every single quantification standard around the world is based on the GHG protocol. So they've got a great website. If you're looking for a place just to get started, they've got this office-based, working 9 to 5, office-based emissions kind of workbook that really simplifies everything down to its most basic level, and is a really great introduction for anyone looking to get into it.
Cool.
Totally agree. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I think that's all we have time for. So yeah, just wanted to say thank you so much to Cary for joining us today. I feel like offsets are a challenging but really important conversation to have. And yeah, just really appreciate the perspectives that you could bring today. So yeah, I think that's it from our end as well. We'll send out a little recap and recording of this to everyone who's registered or attended, along with some resources. And as always, if you have questions about getting started with this work, we're always available to have a chat. So yeah, thanks for tuning in.
And one last thing, Cary, if I'm not mistaken, you don't
Mhm.
need to buy your offset credits through Greenomix, right? Like if you wanted to, there's a way to buy insurance for your existing credits as well. So if customers wanted to
Yeah.
insure their existing, or not insure, sorry, if they want to buy some level of assurance for their
Mhm.
existing credits, and that's something that you guys can work on too, right?
That's right. Yeah. If you have an existing supplier or relationship with project developers, that's great. We're here to support that and help to monitor and correct your portfolio should any challenges arise.
Awesome. All right.
Mhm.
Thanks, everyone.